ahoy. What's up everyone, it's Goose, and today I had to clean up a hairball from my cat. Today we're going to be talking about the Quad Cortex and if it's still the most powerful floor unit you can buy. And we're going to compare the Quad Cortex to the closest competitor in my opinion in terms of power, which is the Fractal FM9, which is on the floor right now so you can't really see it. But so I've had the Quad Cortex for a few months now and I really got a good chance within those months to just kind of push it to its limit. Neural advertises the Quad Cortex as basically the most powerful floor unit you could possibly buy. And if we go by raw processors, yeah, the Quad Cortex probably has the most power on tap. However, both the Quad Cortex and the FM9 have a pair of the 500 megahertz Shark Plus dual-core processors. The Quad Cortex has an additional ARM Cortex A5. However, that processor is completely used for the touchscreen and the graphical user interface on it. So it's not actually used for processing any amp sounds. However, by comparison, the Fractal FM9 screen is basically a BIOS. Both the Quad Cortex and the FM9 are using the same amount of cores to do their amp DSP. And also the Fractal FM9 recently had a beta update that kind of changes a lot of how we kind of perceive power with these units. And even though these two units have the same amount of power, really how they implement their blocks is very different, and I think it's worth kind of comparing the two. And that's what I want to focus today, to see what areas does the Quad Cortex exceed the FM9 and what areas does the FM9 exceed the Quad Cortex. Before we move on, if you like content about the Quad Cortex, the Fractal FM9, the Line 6 products, consider hitting like and subscribe. So there are kind of three ways I was thinking about making this video to kind of show the power of these units. The first one is amps per preset. The second one is how complex of a rig can we build. And the last one is the type of signal paths we can have with each unit. And I won't be getting into things like audio quality or oversampling because I honestly think both of these units sound as good as each other with just a slightly different voicing. And really a caveat to this video is I'm going to be looking at scenarios that aren't realistic. They're just really about pushing these units to their absolute limit. Both of these units have more than enough DSP for 99% of the people out there. And so this video is really for fun. This is all about fun, right?
No fun. Only Gear Wars allowed.
However, the fun will come with actually a pretty serious conclusion, and I hope you all stick around for that. All right, so the first way I want to compare the DSP is with amp models. When companies talk about how powerful their modelers are, they usually talk about how many amps you can have per preset. If you click the CPU button on the Quad Cortex, you see kind of a DSP usage, and you can see that compared to like drives or reverbs or cab blocks, amps just take up the most DSP of all of the blocks in this unit. For component modeled amps on the Quad Cortex, you can actually do a lot. Basically, with any of these 4 amps per lane, I actually have full amp choices here. However, when you start adding a third amp to each lane, there are 2 main lanes here, you start running into limited options in the list. Technically, you can still run the amp, so let's choose one for each of these, and then let's try another one. And actually, we've already hit DSP limits here. Let's see if we get rid of this reverb. Nope, we're stuck. So basically, at this point, we have 8 amps, and 4 of the amps had limited options. And the common thing I'm noticing is that the more settings that an amp model has, the more DSP it's using. So you can actually stretch this further if you use amps that don't have as many settings. Again, 8 amps is a ridiculous amount that I don't think most people will end up using for themselves, but this is a test of extremes. However, if you look at neural captured amps, you can actually have up to 7 per lane, and that means a total of 14 in a preset, which is kind of insane in my opinion. That's just a ridiculous amount of amps that you can have. It is actually important to note that a captured amp does not have the same sort of options as the actual amp itself. What you actually end up getting with the captured amp is just a bass, middle, and treble shelf, basically post EQs, and then the gain is essentially just adjusting the input level. And that's all you get. You don't really get the actual amp controls in a capture. And this is kind of a way to get around using a lot of DSP. And so if you did need more than just the 4 of the most option-laden amps in the Quad Cortex, you can actually also add captures, and you can end up stretching it to 10 amps. So there you go. All right, so with the Fractal FM9, you get 2 amp blocks. That's it. There's no more amp blocks I can add on here from this list. What does make this kind of palatable, at least before the most recent update, is that each amp block has a myriad of options. So you not only have dials that the amp comes with, but also kind of idealized mods, I guess, modded dials onto the amp. You can adjust the preamp, power amp, you can change the tubes and the settings and the bias of the tubes. There's power supply settings here. You can even change the speaker impedance. There's just so much within one amp block that no other modeler offers you. You can even add a boost in the amp block without adding another drive block. However, this is still 2 amp blocks, right? Well, each amp block actually has 4 channels, so you can assign different amps to each of these channels. So for this one amp block, I could have a Diesel Herbert, a Friedman, a Fryette, and a 5150. So each amp block is effectively 4 amps. Prior to the most recent beta update, however, switching between these channels will cause an audio gap. With the latest update, all you have to do is go to Setup, select Spill Over for all, and then Channel and Scene Gapless, and you basically have swapping between these channels without any gap whatsoever. And because this is a global option, this actually doesn't really affect your DSP too much. So in this extreme scenario where you want to utilize all these amps between these 2 amp blocks, all 8 of them, you can still add any drive model that you want. On the Quad Cortex, you might start getting limits within the list that they show you, like it'll gray out certain options and you can't use certain drives. 8 amps is not normal. That's completely a crazy thing, but we're talking about like the uppermost limits here. And again, all these amps have all these settings available and they carry over when you switch channels. The Quad Cortex only has a fraction of these sort of settings available, and you start to get into limits when you get more than 4 component modeled amps. However, this is a super difficult one in my opinion to judge who wins. If we're only going off component modeled amps with like the full knobs, and a lot of amps are defined by the pots they use for different settings in front of the amp. In my opinion, after the newest update for Fractal, really this kind of wins because you can have 8 amps with all the settings plus all the extra settings. So you can basically mod any amp. However, if we add neural captures to the equation, so if you're the kind of person who doesn't need to continue tweaking or doesn't want to continue tweaking and just wants like an amp to go and play, then the conclusion kind of starts to favor the Quad Cortex. All right, so looking at amp blocks alone doesn't really give us a good picture because, as we mentioned, the Quad Cortex can have so many amp blocks in one preset, but we did mention that the more options you have per amp block, the more DSP it takes, and there's 10 times more options in one amplifier on the FM9, and you can still run 8 amps in a preset technically. So if we can't use the amp blocks to figure out which unit is more powerful, let's move on to kind of maxing out a realistic chain. The second test, I'm going to try to get to about 75 to 80% DSP usage. And so the kind of signal path I'm going to have is I'm going to have 2 signal paths. They're all going to start with a pitch shifter, and then we're going to go into overdrive, EQ, and compressor, into an amp, into an EQ, into a cab, and then reverb and other effects afterwards. And that's going to be duplicated in the second row here as a kind of second path. And I'll be running the same amp models on the Quad Cortex as I will be on the FM9 when we get to it. But basically it'll be a Diesel Herbert and a Bogna Vishnu. And basically I'm trying to emulate having a high gain and then a lower gain or mid gain on the second lane here. With the Quad Cortex, I'm actually just at about 60% DSP used, and I can add more. I was actually able to add 10 reverbs and delays and then an additional amp in a loop just for fun. This isn't really a preset that I'll be using, but that just shows you how much power this has before I'm basically out of options on the list on the left. Like it's so slow, it's not even loading right now. But yeah, I don't have any more options to add overdrives anymore, delays, compressors, etc. I'm out of options at this point, but that's super impressive. Like this is more than you could possibly need. All right, so this is the same setup on the FM9, basically kind of a similar 2-path rig here. But basically, I am already at what I would consider max DSP. On the top right here, you're seeing a CPU usage of 78, and basically can't really add any more after this. At least not without hitting the red in the CPU. So we're thinking about working on this maxed out preset, kind of how we use captures to get around the limits of the component modeled amps taking up DSP on the Quad Cortex. The FM9 actually allows you to swap presets without delay. So with the latest FM9 update, you can actually go from preset to preset without any gaps as well. You just go to setup here and you select Gapless for all, and basically going from one preset to another, you will not have any gap. And with that in mind, if you were to take this preset, this maxed out DSP preset, you can split these two chains into two different presets and just swap between them. And that just kind of means you can have an infinite amount of like singular chains that you swap between presets with. Is that cheating the DSP test? Maybe. Originally, why you'd want to keep everything to one preset is to switch between snapshots or scenes so that you avoid that audio gap. But now that Fractal has implemented Gapless preset switching onto their unit, it kind of gets around that. But if you still like keeping everything to one preset, I actually personally do. I think that Quad Cortex definitely wins in that area if you just want as many blocks as you can possibly have. But honestly, the Gapless preset swapping is kind of crazy powerful because then you get no limits at all. And so in that regard, if you don't care about keeping everything to one preset, then the FM9 is basically limitless. All right, so the last way I want to look at the power of each unit is basically the type of signal paths we can create. The amount of blocks you can have in a preset is one thing, but the way you can arrange them is a completely different thing altogether. And so you can have 20 blocks in a row, but if you can't arrange them in parallel, you can't have certain effects in parallel, you can't have more than 2 effects in parallel, then you're kind of still limited in some ways. With the FM9, you actually get as many signal paths as you want. So right here, I already have one break at the beginning, and then I have 2 additional breaks for each of these lines. And then additionally, I can add more. So let's say if I wanted to add this drive in parallel with this compressor, I could simply do that by connecting the units here. And literally now I have another loop. In total, I have 4 loops going, I think. And I can add yet another loop if I want. If I wanted to add something else here, I could do that. And I add another, like, let's put a phaser block there or something. What I mean is basically you're allowed an unlimited amount of loops within a preset in the Fractal FM9. This is powerful. It really lets you dial in that exact tone that you want with all of these loop options that you can possibly have. On the Quad Cortex, you only get 1 loop per lane. And while there are 4 lanes total, a loop takes up a single lane. So you basically have 2 main lanes and then 2 loop lanes. If you have a delay, a reverb, and a phaser that you want to run maybe in parallel, or you maybe just want to run a dry path with a reverb and a delay in parallel, you can't really do that. I guess you kind of work around it with the mix option on those particular blocks, but the FM9 just lets you run them in parallel. And if you're blending a lot of these tones together, really the FM9 is unparalleled in my opinion in that regard. This is the biggest advantage in workflow, I think, that the FM9 has over any other modeler is just the fact that you can be as creative as you want with it. So moving on to the Quad Cortex, as mentioned earlier, you can only have 2 loops per kind of main lane. So you have 4 lanes total, 2 of them can be a loop lane. And while 2 loops is more than adequate, maybe if you're a solo musician trying to make a kind of crazier sound, it might be a little bit more limiting. However, the Quad Cortex can actually run 4 instruments. So right now I have this set up right here, which is 4 completely different chains for all 4 inputs and outputs on the back of the unit. And each of them has a component modeled amp, an overdrive, cab, reverb, delay, a modulation effect at the end. And I even have a compressor for one of them before I started running into limited options. And this is a setup I don't think any other floor unit can match. So you have 2 guitarists, a bassist, and a vocalist, and they all want their own chain in the Quad Cortex. You can do that. As a band for a floor unit, this is definitely the most powerful one you can get for an entire band. So the Quad Cortex wins in the band context, but as an individual musician, you still get more options in the FM9. So all these categories are kind of a wash. And these are fun tests, really. These weren't anything realistic that you would use in a live or even studio setting. But I think the conclusion we can come up with these units is that they both use their DSP differently. If you need to power an entire band with just one floor unit for convenience, the Quad Cortex is the way to go. The amount of inputs and outputs, and you could utilize capture blocks to give each lane a second amp if you really wanted to. It can run this chain without any issues. And this is especially good for like players in a band who just want to plug in and play and don't want to fiddle with settings as much. This definitely caters to that audience. However, for the individual, maybe your band members already have their own units, or maybe you're just not in a band, like me. And you just want to get your tones just right. Like you want to get every single like bit of your tone completely corrected for your tastes. The FM9 with all its advanced settings, tweakability, and even now the Gapless preset changes, I think that really allows you for limitless options. There's so much you can do with this unit in the focus of one musician, and a lot of people who are really particular about their tones, this is the way to go in my opinion. And a lot of musicians or YouTubers who use these Fractal units for a very long time basically agree. The Fractal units have the most tools to help you get that tone that you've always had in your head. So yeah, maybe this isn't the conclusion that everyone wanted. You might have wanted me to say that one unit is more powerful than the other.
Fuel the Gear Wars.
But both of these units are simultaneously the most powerful floor units available. As mentioned with the use cases, with all the scenarios, it just really depends on what you're looking for. And I don't think there's a need to say that one is more powerful than the other. Anyway, let me know in the comments which of these two units would work best for you in the context that I've given you in the previous examples. And that's going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Later.